talking about financial means, and we're gonna talk about the cap a little bit now. With Muzzin's unfortunate injury, we never want anybody to get hurt, and we wish him all the best. But it does have some implications for the cap and LTIR. Do you want to talk about what that could mean for us moving forward, and maybe just describe a little bit what LTIR means as well?
So long-term injury reserve is a tool that half the league is using right now, because it's unbelievable how many teams are either operating at or above the salary cap. But long-term injured reserve is a measure where if you have a player who's expected to miss 10 games or 24 days due to injury, you can place the player on long-term injured reserve, which is basically an upgraded IR, where IR, injured reserve, only allows you to replace the player on your roster, so it gives you a roster space, but LTIR allows you to replace the player's cap hit.
Yeah, so when we talk a little bit about what that means, so we know that Jake Muzzin recently got put on that LTIR as a cap hit about $5.625 million, which means that much is freed up for the Leafs until the playoffs come back. I wonder if now that, since these events have transpired, if Kyle Dubas is looking to fill up that cap space with maybe another big-time defenseman that he wouldn't have got in the past when Jake Muzzin was healthy. If you're Kyle Dubas, what are you thinking about now that Muzzin goes on that LTIR?
So just to kind of backtrack a little bit, like what they did with Jake Muzzin is in placing him on LTIR, they made a couple of paper transactions just before that to get as close as they possibly could to $81.5 million, because in doing that, they set their LTIR, and they got about, depending on which source you want to go with, Puckpedia, cap friendly, either $9,700 away from that $81.5 million number, or even less than $1,000, which means that they'll be able to count on, if Muzzin is out for the remainder of the season, having the full $5.625 million to work with. And the beautiful thing is that they called up a couple of guys on paper transactions. They'll send them back down afterwards, and when they send them back down, they will gain access back to the cap space that they had previously. So it'll be closer to $6 million, just slightly under that. In regards to what they do with that money, I don't know. It's $6 million, right?
It's a lot of money.
And if you're getting salary retention on it, which is sort of expensive, but if they're acquiring some guys with some higher cap hits, it's kind of implied that the other team is going to be retaining some sort of salary, especially when any of the contenders, if you're looking at where they are with their cap situation, don't have the money to take them on anyway. So they could stretch that $6 million as high as 12. And in certain scenarios, if they really, really wanted to, which I don't think that they'll get to that point because they don't have the assets to do it, but they could go and get double salary retention, which is what they did in the Nick Foligno deal, which could possibly stretch the 6 to 12 to 24. So whatever the Leafs really want to do, they will be able to do. It's going to depend on the asking price of certain players. I mean, I know that they checked on JT Miller. Elliot Friedman brought it up on the broadcast the other day. And then Rick Dollywall mentioned that the two had talked, but then he had mentioned again today that the Leafs were kind of just doing their due diligence, and he thinks that they're going to go in a different direction. They could go out and get a top six forward. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned JT Miller. Like, I think all of our Leafs fans listening will agree that he's just like a perfect profile for the kind of guy that everyone's been crying out for, because he can score. He's really good, but he's also like kind of a pain in the butt, and he's like, he'll grind, you'll like do the dirty things.
He's like a more established Michael Bunting, but he's not from Scarborough. So
yeah, so we'll see. But so when I first saw the JT Miller, when I first saw Kyle Dubas maybe go after JT Miller, I thought, is he going after JT Miller or Connor McDavid? Like, since when has the asking price for JT Miller been a first-round pick, Nick Robertson, a top prospect, et cetera, et cetera? If the Leafs were to go out and do that deal, what kind of assets would you be comfortable giving up?
I mean, the asking price that you just listed would be comparable or more to what the Sabres got for Jack Eichel. Yep. And no respect to JT Miller. I mean, they're both American players, but Jack Eichel, JT Miller, nowhere close.
Not even close.
I think you would include a guy like Alex Kerfoot in that deal just to make the money work. Both guys are signed through next season. I believe Miller's at $5.25 million, Kerfoot at $3.5 million. And then from there, a first round pick on top of that, and then maybe a lesser prospect, maybe a Robertson, because you're acquiring a forward with term. Robertson's getting close to NHL ready. Maybe you feel comfortable moving him out. Maybe a guy, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, and it's awful because I'm Italian. We're all Italian here. Nick Abruzzese.
Yes.
Who recently played for the United States at the Olympics. His stock is a little bit higher. He's on the rise. Something similar to that. And I mean, Kerfoot, while we rag on him a lot and while we do want an upgrade, he does have like 35 points in 50 games this year, not really playing on the power play. All those points come at 5-on-5, and he does have the ability to play center. We saw him do it in the playoffs last year, and he's able to move around your lineup. He's able to play in your top six. He's able to play in your third line in more of a checking role. And that's why a guy like Sheldon Keefe really, really, he likes him for his versatility, but obviously we want someone who's a little bit better. But that versatility, and for all the reasons why I listed that he has trade value, those are all the reasons why you would want to hold on to him.
No, I completely agree. And when I just think about, especially in the past with the Leafs playoff woes, what they need to move the needle, the answer to me is not a top six forward. When you look at the top six, it's completely solidified, minus that last left winger. Like you said, Kerfoot fills that role nicely. Cash and Mikheyev can do it there too. Now that you have some cap space, I mean, my eyes light up and say, let's go get a left-handed defenseman on term, on a salary or on a cap hit that's lower than Muzzin, that you previously might have not gotten before. And to me, that's Chychrun, who plays for Arizona and is on the trade block. And before I get your opinion on it, at first I didn't think Chychrun was the answer for the Leafs simply because our left side is loaded. Now that Muzzin is out, maybe this is a guy you go look at. And when you worry about cap space, you worry about it next year. When I think about it, Chychrun is on a $4.6 million AAV, and he's on term till 25, 26. It's a guy that can log you minutes, can score. He's a defensive defenseman as well. Just a really big dude, a gritty dude that you want in the playoffs. What do you think about Kyle Dubas possibly making that happen?
If we're looking beyond this year, there is a world where we've seen Jake Muzzin play his last hockey game in the NHL. I mean, obviously concussions are a complete wild card. We saw him carted off the ice in the series against the Blue Jackets with a really bad neck injury. We saw him suffer a concussion that held him out of the lineup for 4 to 5 weeks earlier in the season, and then this again. I don't see how a informed decision can be made on his long-term health in the next 8 to 9 weeks. But then again, I'm just a journalism student. I don't have any actual benefit, but just thinking about it, for his long-term health. The guy's just 33. It was actually his birthday on Monday when that happened to him.
Shoot.
A guy like Chychrun, if Muzzin is done, would fill that slot fairly nicely. But again, the asking price is absolutely astronomical. Apparently, it's 2 top prospects and a first-round pick, or it's 2 first-round picks and a top prospect, according to Jeff Merrick on a report on Hockey Night in Canada maybe about a month ago. If that were all it was going to take to get a guy like Chychrun, a number 1 pairing defenseman who scored like 16, 18 goals last year, I think somebody would have paid that price by now. So maybe it's a little bit higher than that. But it could also be teams just being a little bit stingy. But yeah, I would agree. If Muzzin is not going to be back in the regular season, maybe if he does return in the playoffs, the Leafs need to be operating like he's not available to them. And then you would go out and get that left-handed defenseman, because a problem with Jake Muzzin is that the Maple Leafs needed a top 4 defenseman, but they needed a top 4 defenseman who would complement Jake Muzzin in what he struggled with this year. And in my videos, I keep going back to a quote that Sheldon Keefe had in the middle of January where he talked about what Muzzin has struggled with this year. And that's making decisions with the puck and moving the puck. So it doesn't make sense to go out there and acquire a guy like Ben Sherratt or Josh Manson, where that's not necessarily their strong suit. You want a guy who is a good puck mover and is responsible, and there's just maybe 1 or 2 of those guys even rumored to be available. And if they are available, their team is asking the sun and the moon for them. So maybe it would be better for the Leafs to target a left-handed shooting defenseman who can move the puck responsibly and do it well, and then get a guy who complements him on the right side.
That's actually that's a good idea. When you talked about some of those right-hand defensemen, I saw them being linked to like everybody in the league. I saw Klingberg's name come up. I don't know about that I don't think that's happening because
They explored it but passed on it.
okay.
The asking price was just too high for a guy who's going to be a UFA at the end of the season.
So then, if we're operating under the assumption maybe that Muzzin will come back, who are some guys that you, Steven and Angelo, think would fit the bill to play on our right side in that second pair?
Oh, man. I mean, in terms of guys that would be available that wouldn't absolutely break the bank where the other team is going to take the Leafs to the cleaners, I mean, I wrote an article looking at some value options. It's definitely not a name that anyone's going to like, but a guy like Troy Stecher from the Detroit Red Wings, played with the Vancouver Canucks a number of seasons ago, has a high defensive turnover rate, which not necessarily something that you want to hear from a guy who's going to be playing in your top four, but he has split time playing in both Detroit's top four and in Vancouver's top four the last number of years. He is a guy who's able to be effective defensively. A little bit of a smaller guy, but it depends on what type of defender do you want. Do you want that big bruising guy, or do you want someone who's relentless? And that's what Troy Stecher is. And Jack Han, who's the former video coach for the Toronto Marlies, when talking about who he would acquire would be a value add, mentioned Stetcher's name. And the defensive turnover rate got brought up, and he said that that's fixable. So Jack Hand's a very smart guy, so I want to believe him. I don't know. There's not really a name that I'm comfortable throwing out there like Damon Severson, but then we watched the Leafs absolutely torch him in back-to-back games.
Yep.
So it's not really – he's good, but that's not really a very inspiring performance.
True. So before we move on to start talking about the Montreal and Columbus games that transpired in the recent past for the Leafs, there's one thing that you said that really sparked my interest, and I wanted to pick your brain at it. You said – the Leafs need to operate under the assumption that Jake Muzzin doesn't come back. And now the question is if we get word that Jake Muzzin will play next year and we now need to move more so towards a rental defenseman on the left side, I'm going to say it just like I said it last episode. Chaminade boys, I think Mark Giordano is the answer. When I looked on Twitter, the asking price for Mark Giordano was like a second and a prospect. And I mean, as a rental player, Mark Giordano is so underrated. When he played in Calgary, not many people knew who he was, apart from people on the west side. This guy's WAR is in like the 86th percentile. He plays against the best players in the NHL. There's a great stat called Quality of Competition, which talks about which players play against the best players in the league when they're on the ice. And Mark Giordano plays against the top 97th percentile of players in his whole career. He knows how to play as a top-pairing defenseman. He won't be that on this team. His cap hit isn't that big. I just wonder if Muzzin is expected to come back and they need a rental guy. Do you think Mark Giordano can be that answer for the Leafs?
I think a lot more people would know Mark Giordano's name. I believe in the 2014 Olympic year, he had a major injury that kept him being off of Team Canada that year. I think if he would have made that team, which was looking like he was going to, a lot more people would know his name. But this is a guy who's won 2 Norris trophies, I believe. One. So the most that was in 2019. So he's 2 years removed from winning a Norris Trophy. He is 38 years old, but he is playing 21 and a half minutes a night on the Seattle Kraken's blue line. He's playing on their top pair. He's playing against all the other team's best guys. I don't necessarily know if he can still zip around the ice like he used to at 38 years old, but he still is effective. Maybe not so much offensively. Like we're seeing him put up, I believe, career high like 50, 60 points or something like that. Not that guy anymore. Probably wouldn't play on your power play, but can, similar to Jake Muzzin, is your everyman. Can do a little bit of everything, and he's also a real leader in your clubhouse, being a captain on the Kraken and with the Calgary Flames before that.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think he won't be playing on our first pair. But a guy who's done that his whole career in a reduced role in the Leafs, I'm kind of jumping on that bandwagon with you now, Ange. I think he'd be like a great fit.